Notre prochaine présentation est grâce à Peter Jaffe de la faculté d'éducation à Western University. Monsieur Jaffe est un psychologue ainsi qu'un professeur à la faculté et directeur académique du Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. Par ses recherches et au travail clinique au cours des 4 dernières décennies, il est devenu l'un des plus grands experts internationaux sur l'impact de la violence domestique sur les victimes et les enfants et sur la prévention des homicides domestiques. Il est officier de l'Ordre du Canada.
My name is Peter Jaffe. I'm a psychologist and professor at Western University. My talk today is on domestic homicides and understanding what we could do to prevent these tragedies. I've been working in the area of domestic violence for 47 years. I started as a young psychologist working with the London, Ontario Police Service, responding to domestic violence calls and helping the police ensure there was services for victims, perpetrators, and their children. Domestic violence is a major social problem in Canada. Domestic violence accounts for almost 26% of all violent crimes in Canada. Female victims are twice as likely as male victims to be physically injured, 3 times as likely to experience disruption to their daily lives, and almost 7 times as likely to fear for their lives. We often wonder why victims of domestic violence don't just leave. They don't leave because of economic dependency, religious pressure, family pressure. The children need to have a father, lack of alternatives, housing, financial support. They hope the abuser will change. They're fearful of the abuser, but they love him. They distrust the system. If they do disclose the abuse, it might get worse. Or for some victims who are immigrants, they worry about their immigration status and what will happen if they disclose the violence. Adult victims are in danger, but also children who live with domestic violence may be traumatized by what they're exposed to in their homes on a regular basis. Domestic violence affects children at every stage of development. Children are affected as infants, as young children, and as adolescents. Domestic violence affects their social, cognitive, emotional development. They may experience post-traumatic stress disorder from living with the violence. These children need safety, support, stability, and access to services in our communities. At the extreme, domestic violence can end in domestic homicide. Domestic homicide is a killing of a current or former intimate partner and or their children or third parties. Often domestic homicides include multiple victims. Domestic homicides for women is 5 times the rate that for male victims. Domestic homicides don't suddenly happen out of the blue. The majority of domestic homicides are preceded by 7 or more well-known risk factors. These factors are known to family, friends, co-workers, and other community professionals. We have a national research grant looking at domestic homicides from coast to coast to coast. And between 2010 and 2018, we've identified 662 victims of domestic homicide. 80% were female adult victims. 8% were children killed in the context of domestic violence. Half the victims represent one of 4 different vulnerable groups, either Indigenous women, immigrant, refugee women, families living in rural, remote, northern communities, or children exposed to domestic violence. These homicides are studied across the country. There are now 7 different domestic homicide death review committees. And a good analogy for the work they do is the analogy to investigating airplane crashes. When a plane goes down, we all wait for someone to find the black box. We wait for the investigators' findings about whether there was pilot error, whether there was a problem with the aircraft, or whether there was unique weather conditions. The review of domestic homicides is the same. We're looking for who knew what when, not a blaming exercise, but to ensure we can prevent a homicide in similar circumstances in the future. The Ontario Committee sits in the office of the Chief Coroner. We have a multidisciplinary committee identifying what happened and what can be done to prevent these homicides. The motto in the Office of the Chief Coroner in Ontario is, "We speak for the dead to protect the living." And that's the perspective in examining these homicides. These homicides do not happen out of the blue. There are multiple warning signs in the majority of cases. Some of these warning signs include a prior history of domestic violence, actual or pending separation, obsessive behavior by the perpetrator, including stalking the victim, mental health problems, mainly depression in the perpetrator, prior threats of the perpetrator to commit suicide, and escalation of violence over time. Often this information is known by friends, family, police officers, lawyers, co-workers, family physicians. They're important lessons from every domestic homicide. One important lesson is domestic violence is a serious issue and has a significant impact on adults, on their parenting, and on children. Domestic violence can be fatal. Domestic violence is everyone's business, and support for victims and children and speaking to abusers about getting help is important. Knowing the warning signs is critical. They're important lessons for professionals across every service sector, from law enforcement, family law, education, mental health, health, social service. Professionals need to know that domestic violence can be fatal. It's critical to identify risk assessment strategies, safety planning for victims, and risk management strategies for perpetrators. It's important to engage community supports for victims, perpetrators, and children. There's no excuse for not knowing about domestic violence and the risks for domestic homicide in 2020. For more information, contact me at Western or look at our website. Easy to remember, it's www.learningtoendabuse.ca. Thank you for your attention and interest in this very important topic.